Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is R. James Woolsey, a strategic analyst and a former director of the Central Intelligence of the United States. He is chairman of Woolsey Partners, an investment firm which focuses on renewable energy and energy security. He was an attorney for 22 years, and he has had presidential appointments from both Republican and Democratic presidents. Jim, welcome to Berkeley.
Good to be with you, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Oh, a lot. I was an only child, and for example, my father taught me to play golf when I was very young. And from the time I was probably 8 or 9 years old up until I was a teenager and going to basketball practice and that sort of thing, I did a lot of stuff with him on weekends. And played golf, go fishing, whatever. And I still remember one Saturday I went in and I thought we were going to go play golf, and he was working really hard. He was a lawyer, he was a litigator. And he said he was sorry we weren't going to be able to play today because he had a trial starting on Monday. And I said, well, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm preparing my opponent's case. And I said, well, why are you preparing your opponent's case? He said, that's always how you start. He said, if you do a really good job of that, it makes you do a lot better job in what you're doing. And I've never forgotten that. It's something that people neglect a lot. But whether you're dealing with Al-Qaeda or Soviets or whomever, getting inside their shoes is a very important and very necessary first step.
And was his influence why you became a lawyer? And did you get involved in following current events and politics early?
Well, yes, I got involved in it early, and I didn't know I was getting involved in it, because what would happen is my father and mother both would kind of encourage me to at least read a few stories in daily papers, even when I was very little. And my father would elicit me saying something about it around the dinner table, and then he'd always take the other side. And it got to, after a while, I realized he was doing it to get me used to arguing about things in a sensible way. But my wife is from the family of engineers, and she said they were always talking about how to do things, and it was, Einstein used to say, "Raffiniert ist der Herr Gott, aber boshaft ist nicht." God may be sophisticated, but he's not plain mean. And I think what he meant by that was when you're playing against nature, to him, God and nature were the same thing. There's nobody, it may be really hard, but there's nobody on the other side trying to defeat you, where in some things there is. And those are different types of problems. A friend of mine calls them malignant problems versus malevolent problems. And my father was always trying to teach me how to defeat someone, at least in argument. And I was probably 13 years old before I realized that, after I'd had dinner with some other friends at their houses, that that's not what everybody did. I thought everybody argued with their father around the dining room table. I'm really quite indebted to both my parents. I had a very comfortable, pleasant upbringing. I went to the same high school, Tulsa Central, that they both went to. I had 2 of the same teachers my mother had. It was a good education.
And then where did you do your undergraduate work?
Stanford.
Stanford. And what did you major in?
History. Except for the year or two after I read Grapes of Wrath when I was about 15, and I thought I wanted to be a labor organizer. By the time I was a freshman in college, I wanted to be a professor of modern European history, and that's where I was headed until partway through my first year at Oxford after Stanford.
And you were a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford?
Yes. I decided I really didn't want to have a life of research and libraries and writing. I liked doing it, but not that much, not exclusively so. And so I dropped back into the philosophy, politics, and economics program at Oxford, and then decided to go to law school. And although I never planned to be a litigator like my father, that's what I became.
And how were you affected by the political currents of the time, civil rights movement, the Vietnam War movement, and so on? Did they help change the course of what you were thinking about and wanted to do?
My parents were both very, very tolerant in both matters, racial and religious and the rest. And I was brought up not to consider those distinctions, ethnic, religious, racial, any of them, as something that ought to be considered. I still remember I was about 8. I was playing alone, as I often did, being an only child out in the backyard, and a family moved in behind us. And I ran in and said to my mother, I said, "Mom, somebody finally moved into the Smith's house." And I said, there's a boy, he's older than I am though, and he's got the weirdest baseball cap on, doesn't have a bill. Mm-hmm. And my mother said, well, it probably means they're Jewish. Mm-hmm. And I said, what's Jewish? Mm-hmm. And she said, well, you're studying about them now in Sunday school. Moses, I said, like Gideon? You mean they're Israelites? And she said, well, sort of. And I said, well, what should I do? And she said, look, they're just like us, except they don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Other than that, we're all the same. She said, go welcome them to the neighborhood. And that's how I found out about Hanukkah. Mm-hmm. Went in, asked to see my new neighbor's Christmas tree, and he said, well, I've got something different.
I see, that's very good. So, but when you were at Yale and an editor at the Law Review, you got involved in the anti-war movement.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Well, at Stanford, just before that, we'd had a big flap with the National Fraternity. A group and I had pledged together, Sigma Nu fraternity on campus, and we invited there were very few Africans or African Americans at Stanford in 1959, 1960. But there was a graduate student, black, from Nigeria, I think, who needed a room, and we had a spare room, so we just offered it to him for free. Somebody had him as a teaching assistant and liked him. And we got in a big fight with Sigma Nu National because it had a racial discrimination clause. And we seceded from the National Fraternity, and this is 1960-61, so it's before the free speech movement here at Berkeley, it's before Mississippi Summer, it's before a lot of things. And it seems like such a small thing now. And we weren't trying to create a big ruckus, we just had this Nigerian graduate student we thought was a nice guy, we wanted to give him a room. But it became a really big deal on campus. It was strange, and even some national attention to it in the press. Then when I was at Yale, I'd always been, as were my parents, essentially Harry Truman, Scoop Jackson Democrats. I still remember a little poem one of my parents taught me when I was a little boy, which was compassion at home, strength across the seas. It was good enough for the Roosevelts. It's good enough for me. And that's Truman. That's Humphrey. That's Scoop. That's and I was beginning my third year of law school, and I'd supported the Vietnam War from the summer of '64 until summer of '67, but I was getting very frustrated with search and destroy and the fact that it wasn't going anywhere and it was just alienating the Vietnamese population. So Allard K. Lowenstein, who had been assistant dean of men at Stanford when I was there and had become a friend of my wife's and mine, he came to town along about September of '67. And he and my wife Sue beat on me for several hours, and I finally said, okay, they won't stop search and destroy. All right, what should we do? And Al said, well, we're going to set up an organization called Yale Citizens for Blank for President. Jim, I'd like for you to start it and get it going. And I don't know who I'm going to run yet. I'm working on Bobby Kennedy, but he may not come along. If not, I'll get somebody else. But we're going to enter him in the New Hampshire primary and going to do well enough that we'll knock Johnson out of the White House and change the path on the war. I said, this is the craziest damn thing I've ever heard in my life. Of course it's not going to work, but I don't have anything else to do, so all right. Al called me a few days later from an airport somewhere and said, okay, it's McCarthy. I said, McCarthy? I said, the senator from Minnesota, the poet? He said, yeah. I said, Al, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of in my life. He said, Jim, just do it. So I went down to the Yale registration and students thing, and I changed the name of the organization from Yale Citizens for Blank for President to Yale Citizens for McCarthy, Eugene McCarthy. And we started getting organized and sent one of our law journal members up to New Hampshire to start the campaigning and the picketing, the polling, we were in our Yale Citizens for Eugene McCarthy. We were essentially at that time both the anti-war movement, and we were sort of the leaders of the most conservative group on campus, because there were two real conservatives in the political union, but except for them, pretty much everybody else was burning something. The men were burning draft cards, the women were burning bras, et cetera. SDS was on campus, and they thought we were a real sellout because we were working inside the system, the political system. But we worked pretty hard on that, and particularly my friend Eric Schnapper, who went up and organized a lot of things in New Hampshire. Yes, I was active in the anti-war movement, for at least for that year. And prior to that, in 1963, after I graduated from Stanford and just before I went to Oxford, I was an intern at the State Department for the summer, and I was doing some tutoring of African American kids at nights for I think it was for I'm not sure which of the civil rights organizations was running it, but they decided to have the big demonstration in August, and they came to a bunch of us who were tutors and asked if we would go through some nonviolence training and be there to lie down in front of bad guys if they came to try to break this up. And we said, well, yeah, okay. So we did. So I was technically a, quote, marshal of the March on Washington in August of '63. And I was standing on up just above the Lincoln Memorial and saw King give his I Have a Dream speech. So although I won't claim any leadership role or anything like that, I given the ages of people, I'm probably going to end up being the only director of Central Intelligence who, when he was younger, was active in both the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement.
And what did you learn from these experiences? And the reason I ask is, in your career, it's very clear that you're concerned about ideas and how new ideas are generated. And how do you see movements who are kind of, in a way, outside the walls of power and the impact that they might have on changing things?
Well, the civil rights movement, although '68 was a terrible year with the assassinations of King and Bobby Kennedy and the riots in Washington and all the rest, ultimately, what happened is it succeeded. And the country is very lucky that we had King as the head of the civil rights movement rather than somebody who tilted toward violence. But that was who Black Americans and other Americans who were interested in civil rights, that's who people gravitated toward, and he shaped the whole future of the rest of the 20th century and still in the early 21st in race relations in the United States with the Civil Rights Act and all the rest. Ultimately, he gets a lot of credit, as do the people at the senior level who helped him. But it's also a great testament to the resilience and adaptability and the ability of the American polity to learn and shift direction compared to where things were, say, in the 1950s and before. And the same with the anti-Vietnam movement. There were people in it who did some, I think, awful and very excessive things. But by getting 42% of the vote in New Hampshire, we actually did indirectly get Johnson to resign, McNamara resigns, Westmoreland resigns, search and destroy is effectively ended, and the new approach that was taken by Abrams and the others was one that was far more helpful and useful and effective in terms of dealing with the Vietnamese people and the Viet Cong. And we had really, for all practical purposes, we, the United States, had defeated the Viet Cong. That's what happened with the exchange of prisoners and Kissinger and Le Duc Tho winning the Nobel Peace Prize and all that. Then a year and a half later, the North Vietnamese invaded the South, and that's what caused the South to fall, but the change in direction of the war in '68 as a result of the anti-war movement in the mid-'60s, I think was again an extraordinary example of what the American people and American institutions can do. They can learn, and they can change things. And there are lots of places in the world, including a lot of other democracies, that just keep on going in the same track they're in no matter what. And the United States is, at least in my view, not like that.
If I could put a label on what you do, I would say that you're a strategic analyst. And I'm curious as to what, if you will accept that as a starting point, what do you see as the skills that are involved in what you do? Namely, thinking about the future. Also, I think I find in your writings knowledgeable about the past, and trying to link those two things in intelligence that helps make policy.
Well, I think strategic analyst may be overstating my capabilities. Yeah. I mean, I think I was a decent lawyer for 22 years. I tried mainly arbitrations and mainly technical matter, cases about technical matters. I was in the government for 12 and 5 different jobs, but 4 presidential appointments for 2 Republican and 2 Democratic administrations. Some of that was arms control negotiating. Some of it was Undersecretary of the Navy. Some was General Counsel of Senate Armed Services, and then finally was Director of Central Intelligence those last 2 years, the first 2 years of Clinton administration. And then I was a consultant, a partner of Booz Allen for 5 years working on energy, and now last 3 years as a venture capitalist I've been working on energy. And in all of those jobs I've tried to take a strategic look at things, try to figure out where people are going, where we should want them to go, different groups, different countries, different interests in the United States. If you want to succeed, how can you put those different interests together and get them cooperating? For example, in terms of the energy issues I'm working on now, I talk about the importance of having a coalition of the tree huggers, the do-gooders, the sod busters, the evangelicals, the cheap hawks, and Willie Nelson. And
the consumer.
Right, well, consumers are lots too. In work negotiating the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, I learned very early in the negotiation that if the United States just sits at a table of 20-up countries and makes a proposal, since we were kind of the biggest dog at the table, people after a while kind of get to feeling resentment and they don't like being shoved by the United States. So I would go to my colleagues in various NATO countries, the ambassadors to negotiations, and suggest things to them, and we'd kick things around, and then they'd make a proposal. And sometimes if I wanted to make sure that the French ambassador supported it, I'd even oppose it, even if it had been our idea originally, for a while, then it'd come around. So thinking about things like how you can make it easier, since this was the U.S. government's policy at the time, to conduct these negotiations in such a way that Germany can unify if it wants, but also stay inside NATO. Mm-hmm. And the unification was opposed by several of our very good allies. This being inside NATO was strongly opposed by the then Soviet Union, soon to become Russia. But if you kind of work everything just right in the right timing and the right sequence, you can end up with a unified Germany in NATO. And you have to not just get bogged down in the details, you have to see how everything you're doing might help fit to help bring that about.
Were you surprised as a negotiator when the wall came down and the Soviet Union fell?
I had been in the job of heading up the Conventional Forces in Europe negotiations for precisely 6 days. And the wall came down, and my wife unfortunately still has a letter I wrote that evening. I was sitting in an apartment in Vienna eating off a television tray and watching CNN. I see the wall go down. I wrote her a note. This is back, of course, in '89, and we're in pre-email days. It said, well, something really interesting going on with the Berlin Wall. Well, moving on to Christmas vacation. Looking forward to you and the boys coming over. Thought we'd go skiing. And I think I'd like for us all to go to Prague for a few days because I want the boys to see what a real Stalinist state is like. By the time they were over at Christmas time, of course, the revolution had come. The streets are full of people shouting and laughing and carrying signs, Havel nach Rad, Havel to the castle, as president. We were standing on Charles Bridge. I still remember it was unseasonably warm, and a lot of people were out, and there were a lot of kids on the bridge playing guitars and singing. And one group we were standing next to started singing "We Shall Overcome" in Czech. And my wife and I both got a little bit teary, and our three sons, who were young teenagers at the time, I guess they were like 9, 11, and 13, looked at us and said, "What's the big deal? They're just singing 'We Shall Overcome.'" Mm-hmm. We both said, "Remember this." You'll think about it from time to time.
Yeah. Now, there's a sense in which another element in your thinking, which I think comes to play in your work as a security analyst, is using history, thinking about the future, but also identifying threats, that are out there, and somehow putting these things together. And I know that you wrote a paper and gave a talk to the World Affairs Council after a year or so after the wall fell, and in that you drew on a kind of an understanding of history that said, hey, roses aren't coming out everywhere. There's still threats in the world. So that's also an important element of all of this. That is seeing through and really examining the darkest scenarios.
I saw in beginning of the 90s that although we had defeated the Soviets and the Cold War was over, there were a lot of other big problems out there. I gave a speech, one you're mentioning, I think, is in December of '92, World Affairs Council, and said somewhere in there that we were fighting with a dragon for 45 years. We finally killed him, and now we find ourselves in a jungle full of a lot of poisonous snakes, and the snakes in many ways are harder to keep track of than the dragon was. And I was thinking about things like proliferation and international organized crime and rogue states and so on. People got used to dealing with the Soviets, and they took too much of a sense that all our problems were solved now that we had defeated the Soviets. The Soviets were kind of an ideal enemy for us. They weren't crazy. They were just thuggish, self-interested bureaucrats with a cover story. By the late 50s, early 60s anyway, after everybody had digested Khrushchev's 20th Party Congress speech about all of Stalin's crimes and so forth, I would wager there were at least as many true believing Marxist-Leninists in the bookstores of the Upper West Side of Manhattan as there were in the Kremlin. Those guys didn't want to die for the principle of each according to his ability, to each according to his need. They wanted to modernize their dachas. And they had a terrible economy that as we contained them and deterred them and formed our alliances and so forth, the economy just could not support what they had to have, and eventually it collapsed. And as it collapsed, they lost the will to sustain their empire. They were part of the side of things which they were a warped aspect of the Enlightenment, but they were rational. And what I said in that speech is we've got another set of folks, the counter-Enlightenment, these distinctions Isaiah Berlin came up with. I've always thought he was marvelous. And the counter-Enlightenment was far more emotion, far more religion, far more nationalism, more Nazi than communist. I didn't foresee exactly what was going to take place at all with places like Iran and North Korea and the rest. But I think people do make a mistake if they say, since we won the Cold War, all we have to do is deal with these guys the same way and they'll be easy. They're smaller than the Soviet Union was. And by the way, they'll respond to deterrence and containment and so forth the way the Soviets did. They'll kind of sit there for a long time and then their economies will collapse. So what are we so bothered about? The answer is, I think you got to get inside their heads. And Hitler kept saying, beginning with Mein Kampf, over and over again, he was going to destroy the Jews and conquer Europe. And very few people believed him. And it was a lot harder to get rid of him, and we lost 6 million Jews and a lot of other people in the course of getting rid of him because we hadn't stood firmly against him in the early and mid-30s when he was weak. I'm very much concerned that people like Kim Jong-il or Ahmadinejad may mean what they say. And we shouldn't take comfort from the fact that we defeated the Soviets one way and think that we can just kind of pick that whole business of deterrence and containment up and deal with these guys, because of course they're not going to do anything crazy, but they might.
In that speech and paper that you wrote after the Cold War, you quoted Keynes, and I get the sense that you really think that ideas, when you
Yes.
say what's in people's head,
Yeah.
you really think that ideas are important in
Right.
in motivating people.
It was that wonderful quote from the general theory about people are really slaves of academic scribblers of the generation before, and people sometimes say that the world is not ruled by ideas, but Keynes said indeed the world really is ruled by little else. And I think he was very right on that. It matters whether or not an enemy is a self-interested thug with a cover story, but basically rational, versus a theocratic, totalitarian, genocidal maniac. If you try to get inside the head of each of those and think like them, and you have to if you think you want to defeat them or even deal with them, a Hitler, or perhaps an Ahmadinejad, is a very different kind of enemy than Stalin was.
Now, in terms of examining the threats that we face, a lot of this comes together in concerns about energy and the environment. So the first question I want to ask you is, how did you come to this problem? What led you pretty early on to see the environment, the dependence on oil, as a national security problem?
Well, I've been an environmentalist for as long as I can remember. When I started practicing law in early 1974, just out of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate where I was general counsel, the first case I ever brought was a pro bono case for the Natural Resources Defense Council before the Consumer Product Safety Commission to get them to recognize the problems with chlorofluorocarbons in damaging the ozone layer. I grew up hunting and fishing with my father, Boy Scout camping, all of that. I've always had a real affection for environmental matters, but what probably really pushed me harder than anything to get into this area was the arms embargo, or the oil embargo of '73. I still remember sitting in the gas line. I was supposed to be running a hearing for the Committee on Armed Services that day, and I was late to work because, as I reasoned, the Saudis had cut off our oil because we were trying to keep Israel from being overrun by its neighbors. I got fairly grouchy about oil that day, and I've stayed pretty much grouchy about it for the last 35 or whatever years. In the early 80s, I was asked by a friend to write the foreword for Amory Lovins' book, Brittle Power, about the vulnerabilities of the energy systems of the United States. A very prescient book. Still, a lot of it is accurate, unfortunately, nearly 30 years later. I started getting into the energy security issues in the 80s. I did some writing and speaking myself on it. And then after I got out of the CIA job in '95, I started spending more and more time on it. Wrote a piece with Senator Richard Lugar on called The New Petroleum, about moving away from petroleum-based fuels for transportation toward biofuels. I've subsequently come to believe very much that national security and the environment, and understanding the needs of what's sometimes called the bottom 2 billion, that is the approximately 2 billion people in the world that don't have access to affordable, usable energy, that those three considerations together all need to be dealt with in figuring out where to go with our energy issues. And I've even written several things and given some speeches utilizing fake conversations with three ghosts who embody these different sets of views. One is John Muir, all issues about the environment, climate change, knocking the tops off mountains in Appalachia, all of the environmental issues he speaks for. George S. Patton, because I wanted a figure that embodied real determination to defeat the countries in the West's enemies, whether they're terrorists or hackers into the grid or what. And then my third figure that I write about is Gandhi, because one of the things Gandhi used to do on his marches was carry a charkha, small Indian spinning wheel with him. He'd spin cotton for a couple of hours a day while people watched. Well, why was he doing that? He was saying to the world, and particularly to people in the villages of India, don't just sort of plant cotton and pick it and send it off to Britain. You've been spinning cloth for hundreds and hundreds of years. Do it yourself and make the village stronger economically and otherwise. And I think
self-sufficiency,
as much as possible. And I, particularly on the key things like energy. And I think that set of ideas fits rather nicely into the notion of distributed generation of electrical power and of biofuels and the rest.
Why? And I recommend your pieces where you create this imaginary dialogue as you just described. But why do you think it's so difficult in reality to have these conversations?
Well, part of the problem is that 3 of the 4 largest industries in the world are electricity generation, oil and gas, and automotive. And they've all 3 been on essentially the same business plan since the late 19th century. And many of the people in those industries would be perfectly happy staying on their 19th century business plans, just updating the technology, but essentially drilling for oil and gas, creating fuels that can go into steel vehicles. The vehicle companies producing the steel vehicles, they'll use oil products and only oil products most of the time. And the utilities burning fossil fuels, mainly coal, and producing electricity and selling it to consumers. And when somebody like Amory Levins or someone else comes along and says, time out, look, there are a lot of things about this that are dangerous and undesirable for all sorts of reasons, from putting carbon into the atmosphere to making it easier for terrorists to hack into a highly centralized electric grid, to building up huge amounts of debt in sub-Saharan African countries because of their oil imports. We've got to start getting together and changing some things, and some of these fossil fuels, particularly I think natural gas, will have a role for a long time. But we've got some serious problems with coal and oil, and we need to work hard on fixing them. Not necessarily getting rid of both completely immediately, of course, that's not possible, but working hard on steering away from them. And one has those industries generally on the other side of that debate. One certainly has the Saudis, and the oil, OPEC. Our transportation is dominated by petroleum, 95, 96%, and OPEC has about 80% of the world's reserves of petroleum. So they're going to run the petroleum business. They're going to set the price within some limits, but basically they're going to set the price. And that's a great danger to the United States, and will be for a long time in the future until we do something about it.
Now, as a security analyst, let's put on your hat cap here for a second. And how is it that the case is so overwhelming that the threat is real? I mean, at one point you say, we're funding both sides in the war on terrorism,
right.
Basically.
Right, we
you
are.
point out that the OPEC suppliers essentially calibrate the price to sort of move us away from going to alternative fuels and new technologies and so on. So it's such a clarion call and such a compelling case that one has to be mystified by the failure to act. I mean, is it that moving from the industries, is there a failure of political leadership, which you have talked about in parts of your career, witnessing that even when you were head of the CIA?
I think there have been some big mistakes made by those on the side I identify with, who are trying to move us away from coal and oil in particular. One is insufficient attention to oil. The cap and trade system, for example, was entirely, for all practical purposes, about fixed facility generation of carbon dioxide, not automobiles. $1 a ton of CO2 in the cap and trade system, $1 a ton increase, adds a penny at the pump. So for $25 a ton CO2, which is a price level people were kind of talking about, that would add all of 25 cents a gallon to gasoline. Cap and trade might have been, I think it's probably dead for quite a while now, it might have been one reasonable way to get at stationary sources of CO2. But it was never a good way to get at oil, and oil emits more. About over 40% of our emissions are from oil, and about 38% are from coal. Oil emits more, and they haven't been dealing with it. I think that's part of the problem. We need a whole set of programs to move us away from oil, and not just toward natural gas, which will have a role, particularly in trucking, I think, and fleet delivery vehicles, not just toward biofuels, now ethanol and methanol, later biobutanol, algae-generated diesel, and so forth.
And you're suggesting to build cars that can adapt to these different fruits. Yeah.
It would cost an American automobile manufacturer all of about $30 or $40 per vehicle to put a different kind of plastic in the fuel line, so it could use methanol or ethanol. Methanol can be made for about 90 cents a gallon from natural gas these days. And efficiency of internal combustion engines can be radically improved. You need to move forward with all of those, and sometimes those who are opposed to fossil fuels and sponsor different ways of going at it form their firing squads in a circle, and the first people they knock off are their buddies, and they shouldn't. They ought to work together. We also need to move against stationary sources. Since I think cap and trade is not likely to fly, we need to find other ways to get at global warming gas emissions, like going after the hydrofluorocarbons, not just CO2. But there are some things we can do about, mainly coal is the problem. But I think it probably won't be cap and trade now.
And why, it seems in this case and in other areas, we recently had Alan and Thovin on, and we were talking about healthcare reform, that to make the kind of transformations you need in energy or in that field, it's really about changing the incentives.
Absolutely.
It's not overthrowing capitalism,
Right.
but it's coming up with legislation that creates a new environment where the consumer has a choice, because you're arguing, and he was arguing, that the consumer doesn't have that choice.
Exactly. We ought to use government on energy the way Teddy Roosevelt did, by breaking the Standard Oil Trust. Roosevelt didn't decide, and didn't have the federal government decide, what was going to compete with the more limited Standard Oil. He let the market do that. What we need to do is use open standards, that is requiring vehicles to be able to use alcohol-based fuels, use electricity. We need to incentivize competition with oil and cars made out of steel that just burn products of petroleum. I think that's part of what went wrong with cap and trade, is that cap and trade has worked for us as long as it was within the United States for sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides and some of the acid rain problems. But this cap and trade would have been worldwide, a much bigger, much more difficult, much more bureaucratic undertaking. And so a lot of the people who might have thought, well, I can understand how we want to move away from CO2 and pollutants and so forth, might have signed on, were really put off by the big bureaucratic nature of cap and trade. And I must say, that is something, I think Alan's right about that on healthcare. I think the people who want to have more competition, not less competition in energy are right. And I think it's quite possible to be in favor of some of these very fundamental changes, but not like big bureaucracies. If I might add an area I haven't studied, my wife knows a lot better than I want poor people to have health insurance, but I'm not sure I like it being done in a 2,500-page bill that nobody has read, that keeps setting up bureaucratic organization after bureaucratic organization after bureaucratic organization. So if one can change the incentives so that everybody has health insurance, and there's competition in the health insurance market and across state lines and the rest, that's, I think, a better way to go. You've got to keep in mind the needs of the people who can't afford to function and have good health care in today's system. Compassion at home, strength across the seas, okay? But being compassionate does not necessarily mean setting up a big bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly enough, when you talk, and one of the things I think you're arguing is to bring the electronics revolution to the automobile.
Yes.
And also at the same time thinking about moving from a centralized grid to a decentralized one.
Yes.
And importantly, you point out that the centralized grid is really vulnerable to terrorist attacks. So again, we're at a situation where we have to move beyond tweaking the system, and we have to sort of figure out ways to benefit from what we do well. And there's a real threat out there.
There is. The big electric grid that we've got, with its huge transformers that take several years to build and aren't built in the United States anymore, that step up the voltage so it can be transmitted for great long distances, is a disaster waiting to happen, because the transformers are vulnerable to things as simple as rifle shots. The grid itself, much of it operates over the internet, and the internet, as we've seen with Stuxnet and a lot of things recently, is certainly
That's
susceptible.
the virus that's attacking the uranium.
Yeah. That it's certainly quite plausible that somebody could try a Stuxnet on us. There are a lot of problems with such a heavy reliance on a large centralized set of interlocking grids. We've got to be able, when something goes down, we've got to be able for people to at least be able to have enough locally generated power, I think from renewables and natural gas principally, that they can at least keep some of the basic services going in their homes, even while even if they've had to shut down, let's say, the aluminum plant just outside town, because making aluminum takes huge amounts of extra electricity, and you're not going to generate that for a long time with local solar and wind and small natural gas facilities. But you can start an evolution toward a lot more resilience in the electric grid. And I mean, I wrote a thing for Sandia, a fake history of the next 20 years, which has a time about now. The grid starts to go dark in one city a day and then comes back up, and everybody goes to general quarters, is panicked, and finally it becomes clear that it's a group of 4 teenagers in Tarzana, California, who got bored with the video games and and decided to take down the grid instead. And then, in my hypothetical, some new video games come out, and the new video games are much harder than taking down the grid, so they go on to the new video games, and they tell the authorities, you guys are talking about having a smart grid. You don't have a smart grid, you have an ODAV'd grid. And the authorities are really, what's ODAV'd? And they say, ostrich designed, awesomely vulnerable, dude.
Now, in this context, if we went to electric cars and we could plug them at night, then this would be a step. So again, it's seeing the whole and how the pieces fit into a larger transformation.
Well, we have a lot of extra capacity at night, mainly natural gas facilities that are built and are there for peaking in hot August afternoons. But only about 25% of our electric grid is utilized at night. So if you have time of day pricing that encourages people to charge their vehicles at night, that solves a big part of the problem. There are some other changes you'd like to make, but I drive a Chevy Volt now that gets about 40 miles before it cuts into need to use liquid fuel. But so it overall has a range of over 300 miles, but 3/4 of the cars in the country go less than 40 miles a day. So on 3 days out of 4, on the average, my Chevy Volt is an all-electric car. I have a Prius that's been converted to be a plug-in. It gets about 15 or 20 miles all electric before it starts to use liquid fuel. And I have a diesel pickup truck, 3/4 ton diesel, that works entirely on biodiesel. So, you know, even with today's technologies, one can make some real strides in this direction. But we've got to get with it. We've got to get the incentives there so people see those possibilities and take advantage of them, not that people get ordered to only use ethanol or ordered only to use natural gas derived methanol or whatever. Not to be the job the government's in.
One of your scenarios in a paper you did for Brookings addresses the question of climate change.
Yes.
And the picture you're painting of the possibilities is really a clarion call to action and really frightening. Let's talk a little about that, because you see the scientific data is very clear, very convincing, and talk a little about that.
I think it's important that by doubling or probably trebling the amount of CO2 in the environment, we are, according to far and away the majority of climatologists, we are going to have a substantial effect on climate change. They don't say that all climate change is anthropogenic. Indeed, they use words, even though they're quite clear that they think there is an effect, they use words like majority. Well, majority could be as small as 51%. But if you and I found out that whereas people used to think cigarettes had nothing to do with lung cancer, and then some people came along and said cigarettes are the only cause of lung cancer. If somebody did some later studies and said, well, cigarettes are about half the cause of lung cancer, we don't still run out and start buying a bunch of cartons of cigarettes and start smoking 5 packs a day, right? I mean, climate's complicated, and the models are not nearly as sophisticated as the climate. And it's perfectly reasonable for some of these effects to be a result of sunspots and tilting of the Earth on the axis and other things. But there's enough consensus that human-generated global warming gas emissions are beginning to have an effect, even if, you know, 1 year to the next, the line doesn't go like this. It goes like this. So next year might be cooler than this year, but that doesn't mean that the trend isn't there. One of the things that's most dramatic to me, my wife and I have been diving in the Caribbean for 40 years, and every time we go back to a place, it seems as if more and more coral is dead compared to the year or two or three before. Senior Smithsonian scientist who watches the oceans very carefully told me the other day that she was pretty sure that about 75% of the coral reefs in the Caribbean have gone in the last 40 years, and about 50% of those in the Pacific. And some of that is local pollution and so forth, but most scientists, I think a lot of it is carbonic acid formed by CO2 going into the oceans and changing the pH factor of the oceans just slightly, but it just takes just slightly. But every time I'm snorkeling and looking at this dead coral, I think, it's yet another bit of data that looks very troubling to me.
And you really argue that the political consequences in terms of the rise of movements, in terms of interstate conflict and so on, could be quite drastic and really enormous national security problems.
Could be awful. I mean, a rise of even a few inches, much less a foot or two by the end of the century, in ocean levels is absolutely disastrous for places like Bangladesh and the Nile Delta and the Yangtze Delta. I mean, so you could be engendering very substantial movements of populations. In Latin America, in a number of key countries, a lot of the drinking water and usable water comes from glaciers, and the glaciers in a number of those places are retreating very, very substantially. If we think we've got immigration law problems now in the United States, what is it going to be like if tens of millions of our southern neighbors are increasingly hungry and thirsty because their water supply is not nearly adequate to what they need? And we got to help them, but we may at the same time be finding the seas lapping rather far into Florida, because Florida is a pretty low-lying place. We need to think about different ways to get at this. Some of it can be dealt with by amelioration. I mean, the Dutch have lived with a third of their country below sea level for a long time, and they're really good at what they do. There are things that the world can do to help deal with some of this while we get a handle on getting rid of some of the global warming gases and the rest, but we really do need to work on it.
You've talked about the intransigence of certain industries, and what I'm curious about is, to what extent do we need to look outside of government and the bureaucracies to generate movement toward a response? And let's go back to your days at Yale and so on. I mean, to what extent do the new ideas have to have a base in movements outside the system that help to change the system and move it in the right direction?
Well, one place that absolutely has to be local is electricity, because we don't have a national electricity policy, or the only institution is the Federal Energy FERC, Federal Energy Commission. FERC has some very able people in it, and insofar as we might begin to have some national policies that could begin to affect some of the incentives at the state level for the security of the grid and the like, I think FERC would be a valuable institution. But the vast majority of decisions that get made about what's happening with electricity in the country is made at a state level in the Public Utility Commissions. And they are going to be responsive to state by state voters for the governors that appoint these people. So what you have to have is, if you want to have what the Germans call a feed-in tariff, that is something that rewards small and medium-sized renewables and rewards moving toward a distributed generation of electricity, it's going to happen state by state. And so far more than the Congress, it ought to be the state legislatures holding hearings, responding to citizen groups, moving forward. And we have 2 states that have a feed-in tariff, Vermont and Hawaii. But if you have a big state go that way and people begin to see how much it adds to local solar, wind, biogas, generation of electricity and so forth, I think things could start to move along.
And so California is a case where leadership can occur at the state level.
Can indeed. Lots about California is complicated, including their analysis of how to do a feed-in tariff. But if they would have a simple, straightforward system that helped, it's so sunny out here anyway, that helped distribute now it's a relatively slight cost for solar over and above say natural gas, and distribute to the ratepayers in the state. I think you'd see a lot of movement towards solar fast. I mean, the Germans have 18 times per capita the solar of the United States. There's one building in Germany, big building, has 2 megawatts of solar on it, Munich. That's more than the entire state of Texas. And the reason is that we've only gone in for these huge installations that take forever to build. I think that, but this added cost in Germany for the average family home is about €1 per month. So $1.50 a month, and it's not a political issue in Germany. So there are 40 countries that have followed Germany in this, including now Japan, China, and India. We may be one of the last places to get small and medium-sized solar and wind in a distributed network way, unless we can get some local grassroots effort in the States.
One final question. Our time is running out, but if students were to watch this program, how would you advise them to prepare for the future, looking back at your life story?
I don't know. I took too much Latin and not enough chemistry and physics for what I'm doing now. I think anybody who has an aptitude for the sciences, it's good to get into them. I've seen some incredible creativity here in Silicon Valley and up at MIT and in Israel and various places where people from really excellent universities in the U.S., like Berkeley, are doing incredibly creative things. We still do that very well in the United States. And if we get out of the mess we're in with respect to energy, it's mainly going to be with creativity. It's going to happen because, for example, we will be able, through technology, to make oil more expensive and dirtier than a new, much cheaper, much cleaner alternative. It happened to salt. My friend Annie Corn uses this example. At the beginning of the 20th century, salt was a really big deal. It was still the only way to preserve meat. Countries went to war over salt mines. Salt was expensive. And then with the coming of the electric grids, it's a lot cheaper to freeze and a lot better tasting to freeze and thaw meat than it is to soak it in salt brine. And within a very few years, salt became boring. That's what we need to try to do to oil. Use technology to make it boring.
Jim, on that note, I want to thank you for taking time to be on our program. It was
My pleasure.
quite informative. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.